My name is Paul Sheriff. Welcome to my course, Building Reusable Angular Services Logging. This course is one in a series on how to create reusable components for your Angular applications. I am a business solutions architect for Fairway Technologies, a premier provider of expert technology consulting. If you are still using console.log in Angular, you need to watch this course to see how to create a more flexible logging system for your applications. In this course, you replace console.log with a log publishing service that lets you log to the console, local storage, and to the web API. By replacing each console.log statement with a call to the new log publisher, you give yourself much more flexibility. Throughout this course, you will do the following: create a log publishing service class, write different types of log entries, create a log publisher base class, learn to log to local storage, implement a web API to accept log entries from Angular, and configure which publishers to call via a JSON configuration file. By the end of this course, you will have created a logging system that you can extend in any way you want. You still get the functionality of console.log, but the flexibility of an Angular service. Before watching this course, I am assuming you are familiar with Angular, JSON, the web API, TypeScript, and HTML. I hope you'll join me on your mission to create a better logging system with my course entitled Building Reusable Angular Services Logging at pluralsight.com. Hello everybody, Paul Sheriff here with Pluralsight. This course is Building Reusable Angular Services Logging. This first module, Building a Simple Logging Service. Now the goals for this particular course are to first build a simple logging service. Then we're going to add on some logging levels to log debug or warning messages. We're going to build some reusable classes, and we're going to create a log publishing service that will allow us to log our messages to the console, to local storage, and even send them through the web API to store in a SQL Server database. Finally, we're going to create a configuration file so that we can control where we want to log to. Let's get started. So why logging? Well, a lot of times we want to do logging in our Angular applications so that we can understand what's going on in there. We might use it to instrument our application. We might want to see debugging messages, and most importantly, we want to be able to track errors. Now, I'm going to assume that you are an Angular developer and that you are familiar with Angular, TypeScript, the web API. There are some related Pluralsight courses if you are not familiar with some of these concepts. There's Angular Getting Started. There's Angular Forms, Play-by-Play, Angular RxJS, and Angular Fundamentals. As with anything in programming, we want to have some goals that we're going to use to establish how we're going to do logging. The first thing, hey, what are the different kinds of log entries we want to create? Well, we want to create debugging, warning, error, fatal, these types of messages we want to log. Then where do we want to log them to? Well, we could log them to the console, we can log them to local storage, we can log them to the server via a web API call. And we also might want to configure logging so we can kind of configure which of these places do we want to send our log entries to. Let's take a look at the overall logging architecture we're going to create in this course. Well, Angular is all about services, so let's create a log service. That log service is going to have a property called publishers that is a collection of publishers that we want to log our entries to. The log service is going to create a log entry object, fill it with some data about what you're trying to record, and pass that object to each log publisher in the publishers array. The first publisher we'll create will be a console publisher. We're then going to have one that stores that log entry information to local storage. And finally, we'll create a web API logging class as well. Now, what we want to do is create a log publisher service that will read in this list of publishers from a configuration file, and we'll take that and give it to the log service. That way we can configure which of these particular log service classes that we want to create. This course will build up to that logging architecture by taking you through a series of modules. The first one builds a simple logging service. Now, this is a very basic logging service class that knows how to log to the council. Next, we'll add different levels of logging. We'll have an enumeration that we add, and new methods are added to our basic logging service to log debug, informational warning, and other message types. Then we're going to start creating our very flexible log publishing service. This is where we'll start building the array of log publishers to store these log entries into multiple locations. We'll also build our first council logging class that fits into this log publishers array. We'll then build a local storage publisher. This is simply a local storage logging class. Next, we'll build a web API publisher, which is our web API logging class that also goes into our publishers array. Finally, we're going to read the publishers from a JSON configuration file by creating this JSON file with a list of log classes to load. This determines which publishers to load and get put into our publishers array. Let's start building our simple logging service. Before we do that though, what's wrong with council.log that people use in their Angular application? Well, one of the big problems is it only writes to the council window. Now, number one, most users never see that. Very useful for us as developers when we're debugging, but we can't save any of that data. So all those messages are lost as soon as you close the window. So that means we have no flexibility over where these things go to. So what we're going to do is we're going to create this simple logging service. I mean, Angular is all about services, so we're going to create a log service class that is injectable then into any component. And this offers us much more flexibility because now we can just use our log service everywhere that we used to use council.log, and then we can change where it logs to in only one place. So we'll create a simple little injectable logging service, and we're going to create a method called log. So just like we do council.log, we're now going to have our own logging service.log that you can pass any message to. And for right now, we're simply going to log it back to the council again. But we'll expand on this a little bit later. Notice we're also adding the date on because we want to be able to track what date and time that this message was recorded. We're then going to test out our logging service. We'll create a log test component HTML page, and then we'll have a log test component that we're going to inject our log service into. We'll have a little test log method that we can call from a button, and we'll then make the call to our logger service to log a message. So let's take a look at how to create and test this very simple log service. Create a new Angular application however you want. I'm going to go ahead and use Angular CLI here to create a new folder and a new project with some defaults, and it's going to create it in a folder called log sample. Now obviously this is going to download a lot of stuff and create a node module which has a ton of files in it, so it's going to take a little bit of a time. So I'm going to go ahead and pause here and I'll come back when it's done. With the project built, let's go down into that folder and let's start up Visual Studio Code. Go to the source app folder and let's create a new folder called shared. We're going to create a shared component that you can use across any other component, so it's a good idea to create a shared folder. And then we'll just create a new file in here called log.service.ts. And this is where we build our typical service. We're going to make it an injectable. That comes from our Angular core. So we'll go ahead and do our injectable here. And we're going to create an exported class called log service. So just like we used to use console.log, we're now going to use this log service. The benefit is we can override or change any of the code in here that we want, whereas console.log, we're kind of limited to what we can do. We're going to create our own log method, and this log method is going to accept just a single message at this point. We're going to change this later on. It can be of type any, because we want to be able to pass in a message, a number, a string, an object, anything like that. So for now, our simple log service, we're going to do console.log. So we're going to keep using console.log. The one thing I'm going to add on new is I'm going to add the date to this, because I do like to know when my messages got recorded. And then, as I mentioned, since it is a data type of any, we might want to stringify this, because we don't know what that is. If it's a message, fine, stringifying doesn't do anything. But if it's an object, it'll stringify that object, and so it comes out as a string. Next, let's go over to the app component.html. Now, yours may look like something different than this, depending on what tool you use, or you may not even have one. If you don't have one, you'll need to go into app-component.ts and add a template URL here. But I'm going to wipe everything out in that app component, and I'm going to simply put in an H1 and say log test. Then within a div, I'm going to go ahead and create a new element called log test. Haven't hooked that up to anything yet, but we will right now. Under the app folder again, let's create another new folder, and we're just going to simply call it log test. Within there, let's build a file, which is our log-test.component.html. This is going to be a very simple page. I'm just going to simply use a button here. And in the click event, I'm going to call a method that we're going to write in our component here called test log. This is what we'll use just to test things out. Yeah, I could use unit testing, but sometimes I just like having a little bit more visual thing that I can do. Let's go ahead and add now our log test component.ts, so our controller for this particular page. And for this one, we're going to go ahead and bring in some code from the clipboard. I just didn't want to type all this in, but let's go through the code. We're going to import component because we are going to be building our own component here. And we're going to import that log service that we just created. So our component, the selector is log-test, and if you remember, that's what I just created here in the app component.html. Our template URL is the HTML that I just created with that button. And then here is our class called log-test-component. In the constructor, we're going to have Angular inject our log service. I've assigned the variable name logger to this. And then here is the test log method that's going to get called when you click on that button. It's not going to return anything, but we are going to use this .logger.log, which is the method we just wrote. And we pass in this message, test the log method. Pretty simple. Just a couple more things to do, and we can give this a try. Open up App Module, and let's import these two new classes that we created. The first one obviously is the log service. That's coming from our shared folder, log.service. And let's also import our log test component. And that's coming from our log-test, log-test.component. like so. Then in our declarations, we're going to declare our intention to use the log test component, and obviously the log service is a provider, so we add that here under providers. We're now ready to try this out. Save your work, bring up the integrated terminal, and let's run an npm start. This will build the project and start the local server. Now my particular one happens to be running on localhost 4200. So once this is done and ready to go, I'm going to bring up my browser and I will go to localhost 4200. And let's bring up the F12 tools and make sure we're looking at the console here. When I click on the test log, we should see our message. Notice the date time there, plus the message itself. What we've done is now created a nice little service that will give us the flexibility to change this later on, but not using console.log everywhere throughout our application. Instead, we're going to use our logger.log method. In this module, we saw the need for logging, why we need to create a logging system. We then looked at the overall architecture of a logging system that we're going to build throughout this course. We took a look at the modules that are in this course, and we built a very simple logging system that we're going to add on to. Coming up in the next module, we're going to add some enumerations, and we're going to create some methods for logging different message types. I hope you'll join me for the next module. Hello everybody, Paul Sheriff here with Pluralsight. This module is adding different levels of logging. The goals for this particular module are to add an enumeration for log level. So we're going to be able to specify what type of logging we want to do. We want to log all messages, debug messages, info messages, warning, error, fatal, or turn them all off. Well, we're going to have to modify our log service class then, and we'll add a log level property that we can set to one of those values, and we'll add a log with date Boolean property to specify whether or not we wish to add the date before each of those messages. We're then going to create methods for each of the log levels in our enumeration and add an optional parameter array so we can pass in as many values that we want to log as we need. We'll add a shouldLog method to have it check to see if we need to log based on the log level. We're going to add a write-to-log method that will do the actual logging itself, and a format params in case there are additional optional parameters that are passed in. Let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is add an enumeration called log level to our log.service.ts file. We're going to put in each of these enumeration values: all, debug, info, warn, error, fatal, and off. We're then going to create in our log service a property called level that is of the type log level, that's the enumeration, and we'll default it to all. So that means all messages will be published. We're also going to add the log with date that's a Boolean, and we'll say that's true as well, but this will allow us to specify whether or not we wish to write the date out before the message. Let's go ahead and add our log level enumeration, our level property, and our log with date property. Back in Visual Studio Code, open up the logservice.ts file, and let's add our enumeration called log level. And inside here we'll do all equal to 0. We're going to do debug equal to 1, info equal to 2, warn equal to 3, error equal to 4, fatal equal to 5, and off equal to 6. Next, let's add in our two properties. So we're going to create one called level that is of the type log level, and we'll default it to loglevel.all. And the next one will be log with date. That's of the type Boolean. And we'll go ahead and default that to true. So we've got our two properties, and we have our enumeration. Next, we'll start adding our methods. The first method we're going to add is shouldLog. We'll pass in a log level enumeration into this method. We're going to check the property level to make sure it's not equal to off. Did we turn logging off? And that the level passed into this method, is it greater than or equal to this dot level? Again, the level property. If those conditions are true, then we're going to return a true, which means we can go ahead and write the message out. The next method we're going to write is write to log. The write to log accepts a message, just a string, and a log level enumeration again. We'll call the shouldLog method we just talked about, checking that level, and if everything's okay, we're going to go ahead and check our property for log with date. If it is, we're going to add the value equal to new date plus a dash. We're then going to concatenate onto this value type, and we'll then actually specify the actual type by the log level, and then the message will also be concatenated into this one big long string, and that's what we will eventually write out to council.log. So let's add our shouldLog method. Let's add the write to log method. Modify the log service class. Add a private shouldLog method. We're going to pass in a log level enumeration to this, and this method returns a Boolean. Let's create the variable that we're going to return and assign it equal to false, and then go ahead and return that. Now let's write our if statement here. If this dot level is not equal to log level dot off, and level, that's the property that got passed in here, this value right here, and that level is greater than or equal to this dot level. Again, looking at the property. Then we'll go ahead and set our return value equal to true. Now I could have done that just ret equals, but I like doing an if statement. It's a little bit clearer when we're explaining this. The next method we're going to write is our private write to log. We're going to pass in a string called message, and we'll pass in a log level called level. Inside of here, we're going to check to see if this dot shouldLog, passing in that level. If that comes back as a true, let's go ahead and start building the value that we wish to log. So we'll initialize a variable here, and then we'll start building our log string. Again, let's check to see if this dot log with date is true, and if it is, we'll set the value equal to new date plus a dash. Then we're going to go ahead and do value plus equals, and we'll specify the type that was passed in here. So we'll use our log level enumeration, and we'll index into that using the level value that's passed in. Next, we'll concatenate in the message itself, and we'll go ahead and use the JSON.stringify just like we did before on that message. That way, if there's something else other than a string, it will automatically stringify it, especially useful if you're passing in an object. Next, we'll go ahead and log the value. So for that, for now, we're going to use console.log again, and we'll just spit out the value into the console window. That means the last thing we need to do down here is change this log. We don't need to do this anymore down here. What we want to do is we want to call this dot write to log, passing in the message, and we're going to specify the log level of all. Whenever you call log, we're going to assume that it's an all. We're going to write those other methods, as I talked about earlier, just a little bit later. If we've done everything correctly, we should be able to save this, and we should be able to just continue on with the current application, and everything should still work. So I'm going to go ahead and start it up again. I had actually closed it down, so I'm going to go ahead and start it up again. So if yours is still running, great. Go ahead and just try it out. Make sure you save first. And then we'll go ahead and do our local host 4200 again. Come down here, click on the test log, and we'll take a look, and we should still see everything as appropriate. Now let's go back then to Visual Studio Code. Let's open up our log test component now. What we're going to do now is let's add on log level here. And now, prior to calling this .logger, we're going to set the level property. So we could set it to one of our values, like for instance, we could set it to off. Now, by doing that, hopefully this is not going to record anything now into the log window. So we go ahead and save all of that. Let's go back. Our screen has been refreshed. Let's test the log. We click on it. Nothing's happening. Perfect. We're now going to modify the write to log method to accept a parameter array. Sometimes we want to pass more than just one string to log. We want to pass some different values as well. A parameter array will allow us to do that. Now we're going to write code to format those parameters and put them into our value to log a little bit later. We're also going to write methods for each log level. So we'll write a debug method that we pass a message to, and then our optional parameters array. We'll then pass that to the write to log method. We're also going to create an info method. Again, passing in a message, it's a string, and an optional parameters array. And again, we'll pass the log level info down to this .write to log. So we're going to do this for each one of the enumerations that we created. So we're going to just keep going with that. So let's go ahead and do our demo. Let's modify the write to log to accept that parameter array and add different methods for logging. Modify the write to log method by adding a third parameter, params of the type any array. Remember that we're going to add the optional parameter, so we want to be able to pass it into this. Now we're not going to do anything with it right yet. We'll do that in the next couple of clips here. But now let's go ahead and add on these additional methods that we talked about. What we want to do is we want to have a method for each one of the enumeration levels: debug, info, warn, error, and fatal. So let's add a debug method, pass in a string, and we're going to use our optional params here, again of the type any. What we're going to do inside of each one of these is simply call the write to log, passing in the message, and then specifying which level this is. So if we're in the debug method, we're going to pass the debug enumeration down to the write to log method, along with the optional params. We can now take this and we can do each one. We can do the info, again changing the log level to be info. We can then do warning, again changing the log level. We can then do error. And finally, we can do fatal. So these are all the different types of informational messages we can record with our logging system now. Let's take the log as well. Let's move it up. Don't have to, but I'm just going to put them all together here. And we need to modify this one too so that it will also accept an optional parameter. And it would then pass that optional parameter as well to the right to log. This is where we're covering then the all situation. So we now have each one of these methods that we can call depending on what type of thing we wish to log. Let's go back over to the log test component. Let's comment this line out which turned the levels off so that we wouldn't get any logging. Let's turn it back on, and now let's go ahead and run the log again so that we can see that we still get this message. So let's save everything. Let's go back over to our test log. Everything's been cleared. We should be able to click on this, and then we now have our message still coming out. Wonderful. Now obviously we could go back over to here and we could try one of the other ones too. We could do a debug one. Save the change, flip back over. Now you can see the type is debug. So each one of these just changes. And then of course you can, play with the logging level here and say, I want error, so anything error and above. So now if I save this change and I go back and I try to log, notice nothing comes out because debug is less than error. But if I now specify error, save that change, we have the ability to do optional parameters. Let's learn about formatting those parameters now. Let's now add our format params method. We'll pass in a parameter array of any data type. What we're going to do first is we're going to do a params.join and make a comma delimited string, because that would actually output to the console window very nicely. But what if there is an object type somewhere in that parameter array? So if we had a product object, we would want to be able to take that and stringify it. So what I'm going to do is just simply check to see, hey, if there's some type in there that's of the type object. Then what I'm going to do is loop through all the parameter array, and I'm going to change my return value. So I wipe it out first, and then I just concatenate each item by doing a json.stringify and then adding on the comma delimited string at the end. So either way, I come out with a comma delimited string returned from this particular method. Let's go ahead and write our format params method and add that formatted parameters to the log output. In the log service class, let's add our new private method called format params. We'll pass in a params array of any, and what we're going to return from this is going to be a string. Remember, it'll be a comma delimited string. So let's create something to return here. It's going to be a string. And what we're going to do is we're going to take params and we're going to do a join and specify that we want a comma. Now we could just do that and any simple data type, we'd be fine. But like I said, if we want to handle the case where we pass in an object like a product object or a customer object, we want that to be stringified. So in that particular case, what we're going to do is write an if statement that says if params, and if some value in there, okay, is the type of P is equal to object, then what we want to do is let's wipe out the string. We don't want anything that came from before, because what we're going to do now is we're going to loop through our parameter array, and each time through we'll simply concatenate on to our return value json.stringify our item, and then simply add a comma at the end. So now we have our format params. Now all we have to do is add that to the right to log. So we can just add it right after here, value plus equals, and we can just say something like, let's say extra info plus this dot format params, passing in our params that got passed to us. And that will now be logged out there. So let's give it a try. Let's go over to our log test component and let's add some additional parameters here. So let's add Paul. Let's add John. Let's add a number 2. Let's add a number 3. So now we've just got any amount of additional parameters that we want to have now output into the log. Let's save our changes. Let's go back over to here and let's click on the test log. We now see that we've got the type, the message, and now we have this extra info, which is a comma delimited string. In this module, we added a log enumeration. We then built methods for each one of those enumerations so we can log different types of messages. We determined if we should log based on the level property set in our log service class. We also added a parameter array and formatted those values for output into the console as well. Coming up in the next module, we're going to create some base classes and we're going to create a log publisher's service. I hope you'll join me for that next module.